All right. Well, thank you to the Global Blake Network for hosting this event, and thank you to Jason and Sybil. I'd especially like to thank Lindsay Weinberg, who gave me useful comments on an early version of this talk and helped me prepare the presentation. I should start my. All right. I'm going to start, interestingly enough, with a disclaimer, one that is completely unnecessary for my audience today, since you are all intelligent and reasonable. However, since this talk will live forever on the internet, and who knows who will see it in the future, it's necessary to say, just because I cite and discuss a thinker like Nietzsche, does not mean I agree with everything he ever said. It certainly doesn't mean I agree with the ways that others interpret and apply and misapply some of the things he said. There's a lot I disagree with in Nietzsche, especially if you start plucking some of his statements out of context, because he was a dialectical thinker like Blake. And he often modifies or seemingly reverses positions over the course of even a single book, because he's not interested in pronouncing absolute truths, but exploring shades of meaning and questioning the binary oppositions that structure much of Western philosophy. A lot of this is also true for Blake, and Nietzsche follows Blake in writing in ways that make it easy to misinterpret him and misrepresent him. In this regard, he goes further than Blake. He says at the end of Beyond Good and Evil that he doubts whether any philosopher ever expressed his real and ultimate opinion in books. Does not one write books precisely to conceal what one harbors? And he continues, every philosophy is a foreground philosophy. There is something arbitrary in a philosopher stopping here and is not digging deeper here. Every philosophy also conceals a philosophy. Every opinion is also a hideout. Every word also a mask. That last word is a callback to earlier in Beyond Good and Evil, the bottom quotation of that slide, when he claims every profound spirit needs a mask. Even more, around every profound spirit, a mask is growing continually, owing to the constantly false, namely shallow, interpretation of every word, every step, every sign of life he gives. In commenting on this passage, Walter Kaufmann says that not only is there a tension between the surface meaning of Nietzsche's words and his real meaning, in extreme cases, the real meaning, quote, may approximate the opposite of what the words might suggest to hasty readers. And Kaufmann suggests that such a reversal applies to Nietzsche's famous phrases like will to power and master morality. It can be a disorienting experience to read both Nietzsche and Blake. Not only are both dialectical thinkers, they both often use common words in non-standard ways that ultimately defamiliarize language and prompt readers to evaluate the meaning of these words slowly and carefully. And they further encourage readers to question their own assumptions. Kaufmann notes that the title Beyond Good and Evil indicates that Nietzsche's writings are an attempt to get past absolute statements and examine shades of meaning. For him, no concept is good or evil in itself. Overall, I read both Nietzsche and Blake from the perspective that they're both exploring ideas, not pronouncing definitive absolute truths. One of my favorite lines from The Antichrist is, men of conviction are prisoners. I've always misremembered that as convictions make convicts. He goes on to suggest that convictions are more dangerous to the truth than lies, and that a falsehood might actually be the embryonic form of a conviction. That is to say, the ideas that you feel certain of and never question imprison you. And once they become your unspoken assumptions, you never even notice your prison. In a sense, reading Nietzsche, like reading Blake, should feel at least mildly disconcerting, because it should be challenging your perceived ideas and making you wonder where your basic assumptions about the world are incorrect. Nietzsche puts it in a humorous way, reminding us that much truth is said in jest. I am not a man, he says. I am dynamite. Many critics have suggested relays between the ideas of Blake and Nietzsche. Perhaps the strongest formulation of this is from W.B. Yeats, who said that Nietzsche completes Blake. although there has been relatively little in-depth exploration of the relationship of their thought. Yates doesn't expand very much on that comment. Similarly, Walter Kaufmann, in his acclaimed biography of Nietzsche, opens the chapter on power with an extended quotation from the voice of the devil in The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. But he makes no attempt to comment on this or link the ideas. He lets the quotation speak for itself. There have been some studies of the relationship between Blakean and Nietzschean thought, but there's much more to say on the subject. And it's worth noting that Nietzsche appears to have been completely ignorant of Blake's works. No one's making a case for direct influence, but rather for resemblances in their thought, and I would argue their style as well. In addition to their disorienting, defamiliarizing techniques, Nietzsche and Blake are both masters of the aphorism. And Nietzsche says that he who writes in aphorisms wants to be read in the blood, understood on a visceral level. In today's presentation, I'm going to focus on two works that bring the similarities and differences between Nietzsche and Blake into sharp relief: the Antichrist and the Everlasting Gospel. Both texts present unique visions of Christ, and both ultimately argue, in different ways, that the historical Jesus was twisted by the church into a contrary image. Nietzsche's title then describes both himself as an opponent of conventional Christianity, and it also describes the real Jesus at the heart of the gospel myth, a different sort of opponent of the religion that would bear his name. Blake's Everlasting Gospel also seeks to recover a real Jesus who is opposed to the message of the false Christ promoted by conventional Christianity. But where Nietzsche considers the real Jesus a passive introvert who preaches resignation from life, Blake finds in the real Jesus a prototype of the passionate artist, one who embraces energy in life, a self-overcomer who perhaps has more in common with Nietzsche's overman than critics might suppose. All right. The Antichrist was intended to be the first part of a 4-volume work Nietzsche was going to call Revaluation of All Values, a kind of summation of his philosophical thought. So that was the first one. He intended the next 2 books to criticize philosophy and systems of morality before presenting in the last volume his idea of the eternal return. Those other parts were never written, right? But the plan shows that Nietzsche saw his critique of Christianity as intricately connected to the rest of his philosophical thought. In the Antichrist, he presents the historical Jesus as someone whom the Christians turned into a figure of supernatural life denial in order to gain power for themselves. And he positions himself and his philosophy against this life denial. So before I talk about the Antichrist, I'm going to talk a little bit in general about his opposition to life denial elsewhere in his writings. And I'm going to suggest that this life denial, especially in its form of conventional Christianity, resembles ideas that Blake associates with the character Urizen, who often appears in his works as a vengeful, supernatural interpretation of the Christian God. Nietzsche's critique boils down to his idea that people are not truly satisfied by mere comfort, ease, and obedience to external authority. And yet, everywhere he looked, he saw modern ideas that were all about minimizing struggle, putting more value on comfort than on striving for greatness, encouraging obedience, and extolling above all mediocrity. For Nietzsche, philosophies of life denial sought to reduce people to a herd that is content with nothing more than following directions. For context, he opposed these ideas because he thought it was the job of philosophers to attack the reigning beliefs of their contemporary period, the received wisdom of the day that is typically taken for granted, those convictions and assumptions. One of the starkest statements of this principle occurs in his discussion of Socrates in Beyond Good and Evil, where he says, a philosopher is necessarily a man of tomorrow in contradiction to his today. Therefore, Socrates opposed the aristocracy of Athens, criticizing the nobility and insisting on equality. Now, Nietzsche definitely disagrees with Socrates and insults him even elsewhere in his work. But I believe he calls him ugly, was one of his big critiques of him. But here he characterizes Socrates as a true philosopher, and he applauds him for critiquing aristocracy and insisting on equality. This is not what Nietzsche is commonly known for. But again, a concept like aristocracy or equality is, for him, not absolutely good or evil in itself. Different ideas gain ascendancy at different points in history, and a philosopher criticizes those ideas, whatever they are. He writes, today, conversely, as opposed to Socrates' day, when only the herd animal receives and dispenses honors in Europe, today the concept of greatness entails being noble, wanting to be by oneself, being able to be different, standing alone and having to live independently. Nietzsche sought to criticize Christianity and those modern ideas that he saw as secular versions of the Christian ethos. He often uses the words socialism and democracy for these modern ideas that he's criticizing. But his use of these words is idiosyncratic. He rarely ever talks about them in terms of organizing an economy or a government. And as an aside here, this is a complete aside, he never mentions Karl Marx and doesn't seem to have read him. It's an open question what he would have thought of dialectical materialism, as opposed to the utopian forms of socialism that even Marx criticized. But that is a topic for another day. Okay, so my point is Nietzsche mainly uses words like socialism and democracy to talk about certain philosophical stances that, like Christianity in his estimation, comprise a denial of life, right? And these anti-life philosophical stances include the tendency of people to set as their highest values at least 4 elements. I'm going to talk about these very briefly, and then I'm going to look at the Antichrist. The first is the rejection of suffering, where the ultimate goal is to end all suffering. It puts me in mind of Urizen's desire in the book of Urizen for a joy without pain. Now, it of course sounds like a good thing to get rid of suffering, right? But it always makes me think of the Twilight Zone episode, A Nice Place to Visit. If you recall that one, it's where a career criminal is sent to an afterlife where he gets everything he wants. He always wins at everything, and he never experiences pain, defeat, or inconvenience. And very soon, he can't stand it. The twist of the episode, of course, is that he's actually in hell. A world truly without suffering would be an intolerable hell. And Nietzsche's point is that to make this your highest goal is to be confused about what makes for a meaningful life. All right, so that was one. Number 2 is an unproductive wallowing in the suffering of oneself and others, which he calls pity. I'm reminded here not only of Urizen's laws of pity from the book of Urizen, but of the way that Blake's Milton a Poem depicts Satan, the fallen Urizen, as precipitating the fall because he has only the science of pity and not the science of wrath also. Pity is a complex word in both Nietzsche and Blake, and both of them use it to mean harmful and helpful things in different contexts. Here, this is the pity that paralyzes people, that only multiplies misery, as Nietzsche puts it. All right, 3 is condemning what is exceptional, right? Nietzsche usually phrases this attitude as a belief in absolute equality, that all people are the same, one giant herd. To use Blake's terminology, this is the tyrannical idea that there ought to be one law, one expectation for both the lion and the ox. Nietzsche sees this as a desire to reduce everyone to mediocrity and attack those that are exceptional. And 4 is a passive obedience to rules imposed on the individual from without. Nietzsche calls this, in that quote at the bottom of the slide, the impersonal morality of universal goodness, embodied by Immanuel Kant's idea of rational duty. Blake similarly denounces abstract ideas of general good that overlook the specificity of individuals and situations, that come from obedience to rules instead of personal joy. And such duty includes the tyrannical moral law that is obsessed with punishing people, often for their natural expressions of bodily energy. Nietzsche's concern was that these views that he calls Christianity, socialism, democracy, and again, what he's usually talking about with those words is having the ultimate goals of rejecting suffering, wallowing in pity, attacking what's exceptional, and submitting to ideas of universal goodness. These kind of things, he thinks, are a kind of denial of life or nihilism. They turn against this world and embrace fantasies of otherworldliness, either a heaven or a utopia, where the highest goal in life is comfort and complacent ease, where the only thing a person has to do is obey commandments. Nietzsche saw nihilism not only in the decline of faith, his famous observation, God is dead, but also in traditional religious faith itself, especially Christianity. Now, it may seem unusual for someone to call Christianity nihilism, which literally means a belief that the world has no meaning. And yet, this is, again, an example of Nietzsche using standard words in ways that cause us to question and think about them. Does the heaven promised in most versions of Christianity actually give life meaning? Or does it rob it of meaning by turning our attention toward an imaginary goal? I want to emphasize that what Nietzsche opposes is setting these goals as the highest values. He's not saying never help other people. He's not saying never do things that improve the world. And he's certainly not encouraging readers to go around hurting people. He's pointing out that people aren't really satisfied in life by mere comfort alone or mere pleasure alone. In Zarathustra, he calls the mediocre, complacent kind of person whose ultimate goal is a life of ease, the last man. And this is the contrary to his idea of the overman, which is a future kind of person who embraces the overcoming of suffering and misery. For Nietzsche, the things that truly make for a meaningful life require effort, struggle, and endurance of and overcoming of suffering, and thinking for oneself, not passively obeying rules. Suffering and effort are key components of a meaningful life. The overman ultimately overcomes himself. That is, he sublimates his passions into a creativity that entails inventing new values to stand against the nihilism, the life denial of the last man. Okay, at long last, I turn to the Antichrist. All of what I just said was a long but necessary preamble to understanding the Antichrist, because Nietzsche basically argues that the followers of Jesus, the early Christians, St. Paul, the church, turned Jesus into a symbol for otherworldly life denial and built all these religious doctrines around Jesus that have nothing to do with what he actually taught. One way to put it is that Nietzsche saw Jesus as a kind of version of the last man, and the church turned him into a supernatural figure whose image they used to gain power to build a world conducive to making everyone into the last man. Nietzsche has a note in his notebook that sums up his argument so succinctly, I can read it into the record, and then you will know exactly his point in the central sections of the Antichrist in which he discusses Jesus. I'm going to take a sip of water here. And now I'm going to read it. Christianity, a naive, oops, I'm sorry, I took it off the screen. Christianity, a naive beginning to a Buddhistic peace movement in the very seat of ressentiment, but reversed by Paul into a pagan mystery doctrine, which finally learns to treat with the entire state organization and wages war, condemns, tortures, swears, hates. He always uses the French word for resentment, by the way. It's always ressentiment. Okay, so here he distinguishes between what the Christians made out of Jesus and the real Jesus, the historical person who inspired the legends that eventually got written down as the Gospels. Nietzsche maintains that the real Jesus wasn't talking about a supernatural realm to come, but an internal feeling that he called the kingdom of God, a feeling that could be generated by a special mode of action, or rather inaction, where you resign from life. He goes so far as to say, nothing is more unchristlike than the ecclesiastical crudity of a personal God, of a kingdom of God that is coming, of a kingdom of heaven beyond, of a Son of God as the second person of the Trinity. The church, he says, was built up out of contradiction to the gospel. The history of Christianity is the history of gradual and ever coarser misunderstanding of an original symbolism. That symbolism represented the feeling of bliss. For the historical Jesus, eternal bliss is not promised, he writes. It is not bound up with certain conditions. It is the only reality. The rest of what we call reality consists only of signs wherewith to speak about it. In passages like these, Nietzsche interestingly suggests that the historical Jesus was something like Immanuel Kant, who postulated a reality, a thing in itself, beyond the impressions that world makes on our senses, an idea that Nietzsche rejected. Nietzsche's Jesus, the real Jesus, is a symbol maker who uses symbols to talk about his thing in itself, which is an internal feeling. The second quote, the Son represents entrance into the feeling of the general transfiguration of all things, beatitude, while the Father represents this feeling itself, the feeling of eternity and of perfection. He gives some specifics about the inaction that generates this feeling. It is a mode of life that he bequeathed to mankind, Jesus. He offers no resistance. He prays and suffers and loves with those who treat him ill. It's a course of inaction, non-interference. And also, it's not faith that distinguishes the Christian, but a different mode of action. He doesn't resist his enemy. He doesn't distinguish between foreigners and natives. He's angry with no one. He doesn't appear at tribunals. He never divorces his wife, even if she's unfaithful. All this is at bottom one principle, he says. It is all the outcome of one instinct, the profound instinct of how one must live in order to feel in heaven, in order to feel eternal. The word Buddhism crops up continually in Nietzsche's discussions of Jesus. And though he describes Buddhism in the Antichrist as a nihilistic religion, like Christianity, he also considers Buddhism superior in some ways. Buddhism, he says, is 100 times more realistic than Christianity. He describes it not as a religion not of morality, but of promoting health. In it, he writes, cheerfulness, peace, and absence of desire are the highest inspirations, and they are realized. Buddhism is a religion for the close and exhaustion of civilization. Christianity does not even find civilization at hand when it appears. In certain circumstances, it lays the foundation of civilization. Christianity aims at mastering beasts of prey. Its expedient is to make them ill. To render feeble is the Christian recipe for taming, for civilization. Okay. So these religions are different kinds of nihilism and life denial. One, Christianity, seeks to tame the beast in humanity to produce the conditions for the last man. The other, Buddhism and the life of the historical Jesus, essentially is the last man and represents a kind of resignation from life. Nietzsche slips a fascinating comment into his discussion of Buddhism, and it's a classic blink and you miss it moment in his writings. He says that Buddhism arises from two physiological facts, right? And remember, Buddhism is akin to the life of the real Jesus, right? It comes from two physiological facts: excessive irritability of feeling, which is a refined susceptibility to pain, and super spiritualization, which he essentially means like a too much conceptual thought. Both of these states, he says at the end of his talk, or at the end of his section here, both of these states will be known to a few of my readers, the objective ones, who, like myself, will know them from experience. Nietzsche's offhand reference to the fact that he is personally acquainted with the physiological causes of Buddhism, which is so similar to the message of the historical Jesus, is related, I think, to his many comments about understanding nihilism and wanting to respond to it. In fact, in his notebooks, he refers to his own idea of eternal recurrence, the idea that the universe will happen again, exactly as it has, again and again forever, with no external meaning. He refers to that as a European version of Buddhism. Nietzsche writes throughout his career that he is seeking to answer nihilism, to propose new values, personal values, in the face of ultimate meaninglessness. And to do this, he attacks the ultimate religion of nihilism, Christianity, and proposes to value affirming life, to value the idea of the overman, the next stage of human evolution, a creative and powerful type of person who refuses to obey expectations placed upon him, whether from religions or the mediocre masses of humanity who place supreme value on being comfortable. So what I'm suggesting is that from Nietzsche's perspective, Buddhism, Christianity, and his own philosophical approach are three very different responses to the physiological stimuli that cause people to understand intimately the lack of ultimate meaning. Buddhism and the message of the historical Jesus teach resignation from life. Christianity teaches outright hostility to life with its otherworldliness. And Nietzsche promotes the affirmation of life. So the question for me is, where does William Blake fit into those three options? Where on the spectrum is he closest? In the way that Nietzsche uses the terms, Blake is definitely not a Christian. I know he calls himself a Christian, of course, but if Christianity is defined as doctrines of otherworldliness and moral law that the church used to gain worldly power, then Blake is definitely not that kind of Christian. In fact, just as Nietzsche attacks the reigning beliefs of his day, so does Blake, except Blake insists that many of the people of his day who call themselves Christians are actually followers of the god of this world, Satan. Like Nietzsche, Blake represents the real Jesus as distinct from what Christians and the church made of him. And like Nietzsche, Blake opposes the church's transformation of the real Jesus into a figure that supported punishment-obsessed, otherworldly doctrines that give rise to obedience to a moral law. Nietzsche writes in The Antichrist, where he attacks Immanuel Kant's moral philosophy of rational duty as a secular version of Christianity, nothing is more profoundly, more thoroughly pernicious than every impersonal feeling of duty, than every sacrifice to the Moloch of abstraction. This is Nietzsche here. What is there that destroys a man more speedily than to work, think, feel as an automaton of duty without internal promptings, without a profound personal predilection, without joy? The most fundamental laws of preservation and growth demand precisely the reverse of Kant's abstract moral philosophy of duty. They demand that each should discover his own virtue, his own categorical imperative, which is Kant's term for the rational duty. Blake could have written exactly that. I trust I don't need to catalog for this audience Blake's many condemnations of moral law, of general notions of good and evil that overlook the specificity of individuals and situations. So if Blake is not a Christian in Nietzsche's terms, the question remains for me whether he is closer to Nietzsche's idea of the real Jesus, which is basically a Buddhist resignation from life, or closer to Nietzsche's own affirmation of life. In thinking about this question, I want to turn to Blake's Everlasting Gospel. I was tempted to call this a fragment poem, thinking of the many fragment poems of the Romantic period. But this is no Kubla Khan. It's far more fragmentary than most of what gets labeled as a fragment poem, even more so than Blake's Prophecies or even the Four Zoas, whose manuscript is in a radically disunified state, which is a polite way of saying it's a mess. The everlasting gospel is definitely unfinished. It's a series of fragments, at least 9 entries scattered in Blake's notebook and 3 on a separate sheet of paper. And it's not at all clear in what order he wanted those pieces to appear in a final version, or whether he would have put them all together if he had assembled them into a finished product. Since he never finished it, we have to be careful about how strong our conclusions are from it. But I think we can see passages in it as emblematic of Blake's thinking about Christ. Part of it, for instance, echoes the marriage of heaven and hell. When Caiaphas condemns Christ in one of the fragments, he presents Jesus as a sinner, as a violator of the 10 Commandments, the abstract moral law that tries to make general pronouncements of absolute good and evil. This is precisely what Blake says in marriage, where Jesus is presented as an embodiment of energy and desire. At the bottom of plate 23, no virtue can exist without breaking these 10 commandments. Jesus was all virtue and acted from impulse, not from rules. Right? And in Marriage of Heaven and Hell, that word impulse is broken not just over a line, but across a plate. The first syllable is the end of plate 23, and the second is at the beginning of 24. Part of what that implies to me is that the creative energy represented by Blake's Jesus contains and is contained within the fragmentation, division, and overall messiness of embodied experience. Energy resists being structured and ordered by reason. The impulsive energy that constitutes our desire participates in the division and productive conflict of contraries, which Blake tells us are needed for progression. The fragmentation of embodied experience and the creativity bound up with it is communicated not just through the content of Blake's works, but the form. And nowhere is the form of Blake's work more disunified than the everlasting gospel. The portrait of the real Jesus given in the everlasting gospel is consistent with the idea in marriage that Jesus is an embodiment of creative energy, desire, and impulse, a refusal to obey generalized abstract moral law, the rules that serve the ends of oppressive authorities. The everlasting gospel explicitly denies that Jesus was humble. Instead, he was proud. It denies he was gentle. He was wrathful. It denies he was born of a virgin and was a sacrificial victim to pay a vengeful supernatural being who enforces a moral law. Instead, Jesus is a powerful force of creativity whose crucifixion is a symbol of his overcoming everything that would limit him. Just as Nietzsche condemns the moral law of Christianity as a twisting of the message of the historical Jesus into a pagan mystery cult, the Church of Rome, that seeks to gain power in the world by promoting obedience to an impersonal feeling of duty, Blake condemns Christian moral law as a kind of paganism, saying, the heathen deities wrote them all, these moral virtues great and small. What is the accusation of sin but moral virtue's deadly gin? Indeed, Blake affirms that what is Antichrist is a sniveling submission to moral virtue. If he had been Antichrist creeping Jesus, he'd have done anything to please us, go sneaking into synagogues and not use the elders and priests like dogs. Like Nietzsche, Blake sees these moral virtues as a perversion of Christ's message. But unlike Nietzsche, Blake presents Jesus not as resigned from life and refusing to resist, but proud and fierce, for he acts with honest, triumphant pride. And this is the cause that Jesus died. He did not die with Christian ease, asking pardon of his enemies. If he had, Caiaphas would forgive. Sneaking submission can always live. In one fragment, in response to Satan tempting Jesus to obey moral law, Jesus' voice in thunder's sound, I come your king and God to seize, meaning the God of this world, Satan, the one worshipped as God by those who call themselves Christians. I come your king and God to seize. He bound old Satan in his chain, and bursting forth his furious ire became a chariot of fire. And thus, with wrath, he did subdue the serpent bulk of nature's dross till he had nailed it to the cross. He took on sin in the virgin's womb and put it off on the cross and tomb to be worshipped by the Church of Rome. It's possible to interpret the subduing of nature's dross in an otherworldly way. That is, it's possible to interpret it as denying the body and the physical world in the name of some supernatural force. But that interpretation doesn't quite fit with the rest of Blake's work, or even with the rest of the everlasting gospel, where he writes elsewhere, "'Twas covet, or 'twas custom, or some trifle not worth caring for, that they may call a shame and sin love's temple that God dwelleth in, and hide in secret hidden shrine the naked human form divine." Blake doesn't reject the body or advocate denying it or seeing it as sinful. Blake's Jesus, I think, subdues nature's dross in the sort of way that Nietzsche advocates the creative parts of humanity shape its raw material. In Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche writes, "In man, there is material, fragment, excess, clay, dirt, nonsense, chaos." I wish he used the word dross. "But in man, there is also creator, form giver, hammer, hardness, spectator divinity, and the seventh day." He argues in this section that pity for the creature in man is misguided, and that his own pity, his converse pity, is for the creator in man. And notice that he uses the language of divinity to describe the creative parts of humanity. Blake's Jesus puts off the moral law. That is, he casts off the very concept of sin, the idea that things, especially the naked human form divine and its energy, could be sinful. And he nails the concept of moral law to the cross, along with what Nietzsche calls the creature in man. Those who conventionally call themselves Christians worship precisely this: an otherworldly moral law and pity for the creature in man. They set as their highest values a wallowing in pity and an obedience to impersonal duty. The Jesus that Blake presents in the everlasting gospel is, I would argue, closer to Nietzsche's idea of the overman, the self-overcoming creative force that gives himself the law, the next stage in humanity's growth that is the contrary image of the last man that seeks complacent submission to moral law. In the original draft of this paper, I began to spin off here into a number of comparisons between Blake and Nietzsche. Some points on which they're similar, some are different. Notably, I had a long section about Blake's idea of the imagination as the mental wars of eternity, and Nietzsche's description of the world as the will to power and nothing besides. Right? And obviously, Blake's idea of eternity is cooperative and inclusive, whereas Nietzsche is always emphasizing how greatness requires solitude and distance from others. It might be interesting to talk about some of those points in the discussion that will follow in a few minutes, but I realized I was drifting away from the purpose of this talk, which I originally anchored in the everlasting gospel. So my final point will be an idea that Blake presents in a prose paragraph likely intended to preface the everlasting gospel. Forgiveness is this idea, which he says is the actual message of Jesus, not moral virtue. If you forgive one another your trespasses, God will forgive you. But if you avenge, you murder the divine image. Now, this probably sounds to most people like the opposite of Nietzsche's opinions. But there's a fascinating part of On the Genealogy of Morals, where Nietzsche argues that the more powerful a society becomes, the more tolerant and lenient it becomes of wrongdoers. As its power increases, a community ceases to take an individual's transgressions so seriously because they can no longer be considered as dangerous and destructive to the whole as they were formerly. He ends the section by describing this phenomenon as the self-overcoming of justice, which is called mercy. Mercy, he says, remains the privilege of the most powerful man. In a footnote on this passage, Walter Kaufmann points back to Nietzsche's early work, Dawn, where he wishes to do away with the concept of sin and, along with it, punishment. Kaufmann describes this idea as central to Nietzsche's philosophy, and Zarathustra contains similar passages that hope that humanity will be delivered from revenge. Nietzsche consistently presents resentment and revenge as signs of weakness. So I'm not sure how close Nietzsche's idea of mercy is to Blake's notion of forgiveness, but I've always liked the formulation in Zarathustra. Rather than forgive your enemies, he advises that you prove that your enemies have done you some good. This is a very different attitude than resenting others, condemning them as sinful, and calling for their punishment. It's a way of overcoming feelings of resentment and using setbacks and suffering as an opportunity to better yourself. Dare I suggest that this attitude may be closer to Blake's idea of forgiveness than it might appear at first. Both Nietzsche and Blake understood the value of having enemies. Opposition, after all, is true friendship. Here's a big finish. Nietzsche gives us a framework for understanding Blake's art as an opposition to the nihilism of conventional Christianity and its secular counterparts. Blake is often read as a kind of antinomian Christian who believes that God's grace has freed us from the law. But putting his work next to Nietzsche's suggests that Blake astutely understood an idea that Nietzsche, too, would see and explore, that conventional Christianity and its law and the secular versions of that law, which Blake calls deism, natural religion, and moral philosophy, are kinds of nihilism, robbing the world of meaning. Like Nietzsche, Blake sought to respond to nihilism, to meaninglessness, and nothing makes life quite so meaningless as imagining some supernatural world that devalues this one and demands obedience to abstract principles. We can see Blake's artistic project as a way of giving himself new values in the manner that the overman is supposed to do. For Blake, very much unlike Nietzsche, this self-overcoming and self-fashioning and creative overflowing is an imitation of Christ, his version of Christ. But in the end, the exact symbols, the specific language is less important. That's all a matter of personal taste. The essence of what both Blake and Nietzsche drive at is creative expression that affirms life and that answers the threat of nihilism posed by conventional Christians and their secular counterparts. Thank you.